Picture the most powerful empire on Earth, legions that have never lost a battle, wealth that dwarfs all rivals combined, territory stretching across 3 continents. Now picture that empire 2 centuries later shattered into fragments, its capital sacked, its armies dissolved, its treasury empty. What happened? You'd expect the answer to involve a fearsome enemy, some outside conqueror who overwhelmed superior forces through brilliance or brutality. You'd be wrong. The deadliest enemy wasn't at the gates. It was in the palace, the treasury, the command tent. Empires don't die by conquest. They commit suicide. This is the pattern that repeats across every continent and every century. Rome, the Ottomans, the Qing dynasty, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, all collapsed, not because barbarians proved stronger, but because the systems that built greatness rotted from within. Corruption devoured their treasuries. Overstretched bled their armies. Internal rebellions tore them apart. Institutions designed for efficiency became monuments to dysfunction. By the time external enemies arrived, they weren't conquering empires. They were looting corpses. The question isn't whether empires fall from within. It's why this pattern is so universal, so predictable, and yet so invisible to those living through it. To understand how the mightiest powers on Earth destroy themselves, we must examine the 4 mechanisms that turn imperial strength into terminal weakness. Mechanisms so consistent they might as well be laws of physics. Geography offers the first clue. Empires begin with conquest, and conquest creates an immediate problem. Every new territory must be held. At first, this seems manageable. Early conquests pay for themselves. Plunder flows back, taxes fund further expansion, prestige attracts allies. But there's a mathematical trap hidden in every mile of new border. The larger an empire grows, the longer its frontiers become. The longer the frontiers, the more soldiers required to defend them. The more soldiers deployed, the greater the logistical burden. Eventually, empires reach a point where expansion stops generating wealth and starts consuming it. They've grown too large to govern effectively, but they can't contract without looking weak. They're trapped. Rome discovered this in the 3rd century. By 200 AD, the empire stretched from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Over 3,000 miles of frontier requiring constant defense. The legions, Rome's instrument of conquest, now serve primarily as border guards. 28 legions, roughly 150,000 men, stationed in permanent fortresses along the Rhine, Danube, and eastern frontiers. These weren't field armies anymore. They were static garrisons, unable to respond quickly to threats because moving them created gaps elsewhere. And the cost was staggering. Legionary pay, equipment, supply trains, fort construction. Military expenditure consumed an estimated 70% of imperial revenue. Rome had built an empire so vast that defending it bankrupted the state. The British Empire encountered the same mathematics 15 centuries later, though on a far larger scale. By 1920, Britain controlled 1/4 of the Earth's land surface and governed 400 million people. Impressive on maps, ruinous in practice. Holding India alone required 70,000 British troops, plus another 200,000 Indian soldiers on British pay. Add garrisons in Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, Burma, Malaya, East Africa, West Africa, the Caribbean. By the 1930s, Britain was spending more on imperial defense than the empire generated in revenue. The colonies, instead of enriching Britain, were draining it. World War II made the equation explicit. Britain could fight Germany or hold the empire, not both. By 1947, India was independent. Within 20 years, most of the empire was liquidated. Not because Britain lost wars of conquest, but because maintaining control cost more than the British economy could sustain. The Soviet Union's collapse followed the same script. By 1980, the USSR controlled not just Russia, but 14 other republics, 6 Warsaw Pact satellites, plus client states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Subsidizing Cuba alone cost Moscow $3 to $5 billion annually, propping up Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, Afghanistan. Each commitment drained resources the Soviet economy couldn't spare. The Afghan War, beginning in 1979, became particularly catastrophic. 50,000 Soviet troops, then 80,000, then over 100,000, fighting insurgents in mountains and deserts. Supplied through a single vulnerable highway from the Soviet border to Kabul. Cost, roughly $5 billion per year, plus 15,000 Soviet dead, plus the political humiliation of failing to defeat poorly armed tribesmen. Moscow couldn't win and couldn't withdraw without admitting defeat. Afghanistan became the Soviet Vietnam, a bleeding wound that sapped resources, morale, and credibility. But geographic overstretch only kills empires when combined with the second mechanism. Corruption so pervasive, it transforms governance into organized theft. Empires create ideal conditions for corruption. Power concentrates at the center, far from the provinces being exploited. Accountability vanishes across thousands of miles. Local officials appointed to collect taxes or administer justice quickly realize no one is watching. The emperor is distant. His representatives are interested primarily in their own cut. What begins as skimming becomes systematic plunder. The late Roman Empire perfected this system. By the 4th century, tax collection had become a criminal enterprise. Imperial tax collectors, known as exactores, descended on provinces with military escorts and extracted whatever they could seize. Official tax rates were one thing, what collectors actually demanded was another. Farmers who couldn't pay had land confiscated. Entire villages fled rather than face the collectors. The imperial treasury saw only a fraction of what was taken. The rest enriched the collectors and their superiors. Emperors occasionally executed tax officials to demonstrate accountability, but the system itself remained untouched, because the palace relied on these same corrupt networks to fund the legions and the bureaucracy. Military commands followed the same pattern. In theory, Rome's generals earned positions through merit and victories. In practice, by the 3rd century, the imperial throne itself was auctioned. In 1993 AD, after Emperor Pertinax was assassinated, the Praetorian Guard, supposedly the emperor's elite bodyguard, openly sold the position to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, purchased the empire for 25,000 sesterces per guardsman. He ruled for 66 days before being murdered and replaced. Throughout the 3rd century, legions elected emperors by proclaiming their generals, who then bribed or fought their way to Rome. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome produced over 50 emperors. Most died violently. The empire became a military junta where loyalty was purchased, not earned, and commanders spent more time plotting against rivals than fighting external enemies. The Ottoman Empire refined corruption into an art form. The Devshirme system, taking Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and training them as elite Janissary soldiers or palace administrators, was designed to create a meritocratic ruling class, loyal only to the Sultan. For 2 centuries, it worked brilliantly. By the 17th century, it had become a nepotistic nightmare. Janissary commanders sold positions to relatives. Wealthy families bribed their way into the corps, which had once accepted only the most talented. The result was an elite military force that functioned more like a guild protecting its privileges than an army. Janissaries stationed in Istanbul rarely fought. They rioted when sultans tried to reform them, demanding higher pay and resisting modernization. In 1622, Janissaries stormed the palace and strangled Sultan Osman II for attempting to create a new, more effective army. The message was clear. The institution existed to serve itself, not the empire. The Qing dynasty's collapse began with tax farmers. Imperial officials in Beijing set tax quotas for provinces. Local magistrates collected these taxes, but the system depended on intermediaries, gentry, merchants, and local strongmen who actually extracted grain and silver from peasants. These intermediaries took their cut, then magistrates took theirs, then provincial governors took theirs. By the time revenue reached Beijing, the imperial treasury received perhaps half of what peasants had paid. The rest vanished into the pockets of the collection network. And because the system was opaque, emperors couldn't distinguish between genuine shortfalls and theft. When rebellions erupted in the 1850s, the Qing discovered their provincial armies barely functioned. Generals had embezzled soldiers' pay, equipment funds, and supply budgets for decades. The Taiping Rebellion, beginning in 1850, killed between 20 and 30 million people and nearly destroyed the dynasty. It began not as an ethnic uprising against Manchu rule, but as a revolt against local corruption, led by a failed examination candidate who convinced desperate peasants that their suffering came from officials who had betrayed Confucian principles. The rebellion was fundamentally about taxation and administrative theft. Corruption doesn't just steal money, it selects for loyalty over competence. Empires ruled by corrupt elites face a lethal problem. Talented, honest officials are dangerous. They expose theft, they demand reform, they threaten the networks that enrich the palace. So corrupt systems promote sycophants and eliminate threats. The Qing examination system, once a meritocracy that elevated China's brightest, became a mechanism for ensuring candidates demonstrated loyalty, classical learning, and poetic skill. but not administrative competence or moral courage. The Soviet Union followed the same path. Stalin's purges in the 1930s eliminated millions of competent administrators, engineers, and military officers, replacing them with loyalists whose primary qualification was survival. Officials sabotaged changes that threatened their privileges. The state that had industrialized Russia in a generation couldn't fix a stagnant economy because the people in charge benefited from stagnation. This brings us to the third mechanism: internal rebellion. Empires are, by definition, multi-ethnic and multi-regional. The core roams Italy, Britain's England, Russia's Slavic heartland, governs peripheries that didn't choose to be conquered. These peripheries provide soldiers, taxes, and resources, but they don't share equally in imperial benefits. Over time, this creates resentment, and when resentment combines with opportunity, economic crisis, military defeat, weak leadership, rebellions ignite. Rome's 3rd century crisis demonstrated how quickly empires fragment. In 260 AD, the Roman Empire split into 3 pieces. The central government, based in Rome, still claimed authority, but the western provinces, Gaul, Britain, Spain, seceded under a general named Postumus, creating the Gallic Empire. In the east, the city of Palmyra, led by Queen Zenobia, carved out an independent realm encompassing Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor. For 15 years, there was no single Roman Empire, just 3 competing states, each claiming legitimacy. What caused this? Not external invasion, but internal collapse. The legitimate emperor Valerian had been captured by Persia. His son, Gallienus, couldn't simultaneously defend the Rhine, the Danube, and the eastern frontier. So the provinces stopped waiting for Rome's protection and declared independence. When Emperor Aurelian reunited the empire in 274, it was through reconquest. Rome was literally fighting Rome. Crisis ended, but the lesson remained: imperial unity was contingent, not inevitable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's collapse followed the same script. By 1914, the empire governed Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, and Italians. 11 major ethnic groups speaking 8 languages, practicing 3 religions, and sharing virtually no common identity except subjugation to Vienna. During World War I, the empire mobilized these groups to fight for Habsburg interests. Why would a Czech conscript die for an empire that marginalized his language and culture? Why would a Serb fight alongside Austrians who had bombarded Belgrade? Predictably, units mutinied or surrendered. By 1918, even before military defeat, the empire was disintegrating. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia declared independence not after conquest, but after recognizing Vienna couldn't stop them. Austria-Hungary didn't fall to the Allies. It dissolved because its constituent peoples decided the empire no longer served them. Instead, they revealed how little the non-Russian republics valued Soviet rule. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had been forcibly annexed in 1940. They had never accepted Soviet legitimacy. When Gorbachev relaxed controls in the late 1980s, independence movements emerged instantly. Ukraine, with 52 million people, held a referendum in 1991. Over 90% voted for independence. Not because Western armies invaded, but because Ukrainians decided they were done subsidizing Moscow. By December 1991, the Soviet Union had dissolved. 15 republics became 15 nations. The Red Army, still the world's largest military, did nothing, because the soldiers themselves had stopped believing in the cause. You can't hold an empire together when the people being governed conclude the costs exceed the benefits. Which brings us to the fourth and final mechanism: institutional decay. Empires build systems, bureaucracies, armies, legal codes, infrastructure that enable governance.
At their peak, these systems function with remarkable efficiency.
Roman roads allowed messages to travel from Britain to Syria in weeks. Ottoman courts administered justice across 3 continents using a unified legal code. The British civil service governed 400 million Indians, with fewer than 2,000 British administrators. But institutions calcify. Procedures designed for one era become obstacles in another. Bureaucracies grow bloated. Militaries optimize for past wars. Elites resist innovation because it threatens their status. What once enabled empire becomes a straitjacket. Ming Dynasty's collapse illustrated this perfectly. By the early 1600s, the Ming military, once the world's most formidable, had become a hollow shell. On paper, China fielded millions of soldiers. In reality, generals embezzled pay, sold positions, and kept rosters filled with ghost soldiers. Fictitious names used to collect stipends. When Manchu invaders crossed the Great Wall in 1644, Ming armies disintegrated. Soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Weapons were outdated or non-existent. Commanders fled rather than fight. The Ming fell not because the Manchus were militarily superior, but because the institution responsible for defense had stopped functioning. Emperor Chongzhen, the last Ming ruler, hanged himself as rebels entered Beijing. The note he left blamed his officials for abandoning him. He was right, but he failed to understand why. The system he inherited rewarded loyalty and corruption over competence and integrity. By the time he recognized this, reform was impossible. The Ottoman Empire's 19th century experience followed the same trajectory. Recognizing they were falling behind European powers, sultans attempted modernization. The Tanzimat reforms beginning in 1839 tried to reorganize the military, rationalize taxation, and create secular legal codes. Every reform encountered resistance from entrenched interests. The Janissaries, despite being militarily obsolete, fought modernization because new armies threatened their privileges. Religious scholars opposed secular law because it undermined their authority. Provincial governors resisted centralization because it reduced their autonomy. Sultan Mahmud II finally dissolved the Janissaries in 1826 by massacring them, an indication of how violently institutions resist their own reform. Even then, modernization proceeded slowly, sabotaged at every level by officials who recognized that efficiency threatened their positions. The Soviet Union in the 1980s was a case study in institutional paralysis. The Communist Party, the military, the KGB, the industrial ministries, all had become self-perpetuating bureaucracies, interested primarily in their own survival. Economic stagnation was obvious. Living standards lagged decades behind the West. Technological innovation had ceased. But every attempt at reform threatened someone's rice bowl. Factory managers didn't want efficiency standards because they'd be exposed as incompetent. Military officers resisted budget cuts because smaller forces meant fewer promotion opportunities. Soldiers looked at their officers and asked why they should kill Russians to preserve a system that hadn't worked in decades. The institution designed to protect the USSR allowed it to dissolve because even the military no longer believed. This is the pattern. Geographic overstretch forces empires to defend territories they can no longer afford. Corruption transforms governance into theft, enriching elites while bankrupting the state. Internal rebellions fragment empires into competing factions, each refusing to subsidize the center. Institutional decay ensures that when crisis arrives, the systems meant to respond simply stop working. And critically, these mechanisms reinforce each other. Corruption accelerates, overstretch, because stolen revenues can't fund defense. Overstretch fuels rebellion because peripheral regions bear costs without protection. Rebellion accelerates institutional decay because empires bypass broken systems with ad hoc measures that undermine long-term stability. Rome's collapse between 200 and 476 AD involved all four. The empire was too large to defend affordably. Tax collection became predatory, driving provinces to support any strongman who promised relief. The western provinces repeatedly seceded or welcomed barbarian rulers as preferable to Rome's extortion, and the institutions, the legions, the civil service, the currency itself, ceased functioning. By the 5th century, Roman armies were mostly Germanic mercenaries commanded by barbarian generals. Emperors were puppets. The last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was a teenager installed by his father, a Germanic warlord. When another warlord, Odoacer, deposed him in 476, no one bothered to appoint a replacement. Western Empire hadn't been conquered. It had stopped existing because no one saw value in maintaining it. The British Empire's liquidation after World War II followed a more orderly path, but the same logic. Britain emerged from the war victorious but bankrupt. The United States had financed British survival through Lend-Lease, and Washington made clear that continued aid depended on decolonization. Holding India, which required vast military expenditure, was no longer affordable. Neither was defending Palestine against Jewish and Arab insurgents, or suppressing independence movements in Malaysia, Kenya, Cyprus. The costs exceeded Britain's economy. And crucially, the institutions that had run the empire, the colonial civil service, the Indian Army, the Royal Navy's global presence, couldn't be sustained. India became independent in 1947. Within 2 decades, most of Africa and Asia followed. Britain didn't lose wars of independence. It calculated that fighting them would cost more than the territories were worth. The empire died from cost-benefit analysis. The Soviet collapse in 1991 was the fastest. Unlike Rome or Britain, the USSR disintegrated in months. August 1991, it was a superpower with 5 million soldiers and 30,000 nuclear weapons. December 1991, it didn't exist. What happened? All four mechanisms converged simultaneously. The Soviet economy, crippled by decades of inefficiency and corruption, could no longer afford the military, the subsidies to Eastern Europe, the client states, or the internal security apparatus. Non-Russian republics saw opportunity and declared independence. The Communist Party, the KGB, the military institutions that had held the Union together, split along ethnic and factional lines. And critically, the people charged with defending the system decided not to. When the hardliners attempted a coup in August 1991, tank crews refused to fire on civilians. The institution designed to enforce communist rule concluded the system wasn't worth saving. The Soviet Union died not because NATO invaded, but because its own people, including its own military, walked away. So why is this pattern so universal? Why do empires, despite millennia of historical examples, repeatedly make the same fatal errors? The answer lies in the nature of imperial success, the qualities that build empires: military aggression, ruthless exploitation of conquered territories, centralized authority, create the conditions for collapse. Expansion generates wealth and prestige, encouraging further expansion until overstretch becomes inevitable. Centralized power attracts the ambitious and corrupt, who capture institutions and extract wealth. Multi-ethnic empires inevitably privilege the core over peripheries, generating resentment. And success breeds complacency. Empires assume their dominance is permanent and fail to recognize rot until it's irreversible. Moreover, ruling elites have no incentive to reform. Corruption enriches them. Overstretch doesn't affect them. Provincial garrisons suffer while the capital enjoys plunder. Internal rebellions can be blamed on external enemies or disloyal subjects. Institutional decay isn't visible until systems fail catastrophically, and by then, those responsible have already profited. This is why emperors throughout history, when warned of impending collapse, dismissed the warnings. Qing emperors ignored reports of provincial corruption until rebellion exploded. Ottoman sultans believed the empire was eternal, even as it lost war after war. Soviet leaders insisted the USSR would outlast capitalism, even as shortages paralyzed the economy. The people with power to reform are precisely those who benefit from the status quo. And external enemies? They're symptoms, not causes. The barbarians who sacked Rome in 410 and 455 didn't conquer the empire. They raided a state that could no longer defend itself. The Manchus who founded the Qing dynasty in 1644 didn't defeat the Ming through military superiority. They filled a power vacuum after Ming institutions imploded. NATO didn't destroy the Soviet Union. Moscow's own economic mismanagement and imperial overstretch did. External enemies exploit internal weakness. They don't create it. Which raises a final, uncomfortable question. Does any empire escape this pattern? History suggests no. Every empire that has ever existed has collapsed. Some, like Rome, took centuries. Others, like the USSR, took decades. But the mechanisms, corruption, overstretch, internal rebellion, institutional decay, are consistent. Empires are inherently unstable because they require constant expansion to sustain themselves. But expansion creates ungovernable territories, invites corruption, generates resistance, and overwhelms institutions. It's a mathematical certainty, not a moral judgment. The human cost of this pattern is staggering. The 3rd century crisis killed millions through war, famine, and plague. The British Empire's partition of India in 1947 triggered communal violence that killed between 1 and 2 million people. Empires don't collapse quietly. They shatter, and the fragments cut everyone in their path. So the lesson isn't that empires fall because they're evil. It's that empires fall because they're unsustainable. The forces that build them, conquest, extraction, centralized control, guarantee eventual collapse. And the tragedy is that this pattern is invisible to those living through it. To Roman senators in 200 AD, the empire seemed eternal. To British officials in 1920, the empire seemed unshakable. To Soviet leaders in 1985, the Union seemed permanent. In each case, the collapse, when it came, seemed sudden. But it wasn't. The mechanisms had been working for decades, accumulating failures too diffuse to recognize until they converged into catastrophe. The empires are gone, the pattern remains. Geography still punishes overstretch, corruption still devours institutions, peripheral regions still rebel when costs exceed benefits. Bureaucracies still calcify and resist reform, and the powerful still convince themselves that their dominance is different, that history's lessons don't apply, that this time it won't collapse from within. They're always wrong. The question isn't whether empires fall from within, it's whether anyone learns before the next collapse begins.